Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy, and I'm here today with Jeff Vaillant, who has researched his Italian family from Sicily and Milan, and he was also the president of the California Genealogical Society. So, welcome, Jeff. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
So, how are things out there in sunny California today?
Well, it's not exactly sunny California, Northern California. It's wet, and we love the wetness. You know, the rain can just keep coming.
Yeah, I love San Francisco. I was out there a couple of times, and great city to walk around,
Yeah,
great Italian restaurants for sure.
yeah, North Beach area, of course.
Yeah. In fact, my first time there, I was just walking across town. I think this was 1985 or something, and I saw this little Italian restaurant, and I went in there, and I had this really great Italian meal. And being I'm from New York, that's not easy to say.
That's right.
Let's talk a little bit about your Italian families. I know they come from Sicily and Milan, and I'm assuming you've been researching for quite some time. Yeah.
Well, actually, yes and no. My genealogy adventure began probably in high school when I sat down with my grandmother, Louise Douglas McIntosh, and did one of those onion skin paper family chart things. And, you know, like most, it had stories that I was interested in. And then, frankly, you know, kind of life and family and school and so forth interrupted. And in fact, during the time, my mother continued to do genealogy pretty much on her side. And she tried to figure out her husband, Ben Vaillant, what his genealogy was, but really couldn't hook into it. She passed away in 1989. And about 10 years later, I went to my father and said, "Hey, Mom was doing all this genealogy work. Whatever happened to it?" Bless his little heart, he saved it. And so he gave me a huge box of her work. And that really started my intense journey into genealogy about a little over 20 years ago. And the real key actually was I had a delayed birth certificate for my Aunt June, my father's sister, that she'd done in 1944. And when you do a delayed birth certificate, you have to prove what it is you're trying to prove. Her case, she was trying to prove her birth date. And so she gave four different pieces of evidence, if you will. One was an affidavit from her mother, and another was the fact of her residency then in Seattle, Washington. And she actually cited a baptismal record in a church in St. Louis. Fortunately for me, that baptismal record was online and I could look at it. And boy, was I surprised, because after 60 some odd years, I'd found out that my paternal line was not Vaillant, but it was actually Venziano,
Hmm.
that there had been a bit of a lie, or as I call it, lies, lies, and damn lies in the family. So it was a shock, you know, after thinking, I'm a Frenchman, wonderful. But then I said, hey, nothing wrong with being a Sicilian either. So that began my journey, if you will.
Well, one might argue that being a Sicilian is much better than being a Frenchman, but there's probably some French in there anyway. Uh,
Yeah,
so that's really cool. So you had no idea that you were Italian.
I had no idea. And frankly, my father, his two sisters, and their mother took the secret to the grave. It was only after they were all passed on, finding this document that allowed me to start digging around. And it sure helps when you have the right surname when you're doing some research. And of course, Venziano was kind of misspelled and mispronounced, but bingo, with that, I found my grandmother's marriage certificate, or my paternal grandfather's marriage license and certificate. And they were in St. Louis, and they were in the 1910 census. And in 1909, my aunt June was born. They were married in 1907. And the kids popped out. In 1911, my Aunt Pauline popped out. In 1913, my father popped out. And so it was a real adventure to find the records, if you will, the documentation. And I'd say one of the stories that haunted my father, even though he never owned up to his real surname, was he remembered having another sibling. And I'd ask him from time to time what he remembered, and he could not remember if it was a boy or girl, but he had this keen sense of having another sibling. Well, with the discovery of the name, I went digging some more, and sure enough, there was a Gloria Venziano born in 1915. So the pattern was there, right? 1909, 1911, 1913, 1915. And I found her, and I found her death certificate, which tied her together with the parents, in 1917. The thing that was interesting about this is he knew this, he had this experience, but he couldn't nail it down. Turned out she was buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillsdale, outside of Chicago, and we lived within 3 miles of her burial site, and he never knew it.
Wow, that is something.
Yeah.
Was there? Did they change the name for business purposes, or because I know back then, especially in the early 1900s, there was a lot of anti-Italian things going on. So, do you know why he changed the name, or they changed the name?
Well, I did. Of course, I did a lot of documentation on that, and I could follow to 1920 to Chicago, and apparently in 1919, the paternal grandfather, August, abandoned the family, so he left a woman with 3 young kids. And so I started looking at the Chicago school records and tracing them, and I could find my Aunt June and my Aunt Pauline and even my father all the way till 1928. A funny thing happened in the summer of 1928. First of all, my father graduated from 8th grade, and he would go on to Lane Technical High School. And at Lane Technical High School, he was no longer a Venziano. And my thinking is that in the summer of 1928, June, the oldest, sat down with her sister and brother and mother and said, "Hey, we are no longer going to be Venzianos, we're going to be Vaillants." And so, my humor is the luggage tags didn't have to be changed for her. She went from June Venziano to June Vaillant. However, another interesting quirk is there was a Francesco Vaillant hanging around the premises. In fact, Francesco and August both worked at the same Edison Electric Company in Chicago at the same time about World War I draft registration. And it turns out Frank, as he became known, hung around, went off to Texas, came back when my cousin Patty was born. And in fact, I met crazy Uncle Frank in Seattle in the early 50s in his robe, raking the shag carpet in the living room. So I have a hunch that because it was Frank Vaillant, June decided, good name, good French name, and she adopted it. And in fact, by 1930, Mom, Mary, is actually born in France. Oh, but by 1940, Mary's born in Switzerland. A lot going on in the family.
Wow, that's really, really interesting. All right, so that's a lot of detective work in the United States. So you have all this information. So now, have you gotten it back to Sicily, and what's that story?
Yeah, I actually did it in like 2 different phases, if you will. One is I actually hired the Legacy family people in Salt Lake City and said, here's what I know. I'd figured out where August was born, so I had some information to work on. So I said, here's what I've got. What else can you find me? And they went to work, and they made a lot of documentation finds for the direct line itself. And that was helpful, although it was a little expensive, but to me, it was worth it, okay? And secondly is serendipity, and that's a wonderful part of genealogy. I happened to notice that my grandmother's, paternal grandmother's name was Francesca Magnosa. So I thought, well, let's see what happens. Well, it just turns out there's a Francesca Magnosa that I came across on Facebook. She happens to own a travel agency. And so I wrote her and said, hi, cousin, maybe we're related. Well, we haven't proved the relation yet, but over 18 months, she was gracious enough and funded by me and a couple of cousins to go get more records on the family from Calascibetta and from Augusta in Sicily. So it made even a more full, complete picture of birth, marriages, and deaths and where they were and what they were doing.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.com. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co. Yeah, and Facebook's a great tool. I don't think enough people realize, but if you know the town where somebody comes from, and that's what I did, and in a couple of cases, with my paternal grandmother, her name is Piramalo. There's only two in the United States. She came, and her aunt came 10 years before her, and I knew they were from Naples, and she was from a noble family, so I knew that. And I just went on Facebook, and every Piramalo I could find, hey, this is my third great grandparents, my second great parents. You ever hear of these people? And slowly but surely, they started coming back and saying, yes, we know who that is. And they would send photos, and they had some couple of artifacts and things like that. So it is a very, very powerful tool. And in some cases, maybe even better than Ancestry, because you're actually conversing with people as opposed to just looking for something on a screen, So now, have you been back to Italy, to either of these places?
Well, the irony is I was in northern Italy, Lake Como area, probably in the early 1970s. Didn't know diddly then. And then secondly, yes, in 2018, I convinced my first cousin, Pat, and my second cousin, Paul, to go to Sicily. So the three of us took off and went and did a 10-day tour of Sicily in 2018. And at the tag end, I added a couple days because I wanted to do genealogy, and Paul loves volcanoes, and he wanted to do Mount Etna. So when he went off to Mount Etna, my cousin Pat and I went to Augusta, went to the cemetery, and did what we could in the time allowed. So Sicily is a great place. And I intend to convince at least some, if not more, cousins to return in 2022.
Yeah, we when we lived in England, we made a trip to Rome. Of course, you have to go to Rome, and we went to Sorrento. And I knew that my father's family was from Naples, but I didn't know anything really at that time. And we just went and we stopped in Naples to pick up a car to drive down to Sorrento. And as I've done my research now, the last 12 or 15 years or whatever, I found out that both of my father's parents' families they lived a half a mile from the train station in Naples. And right on the main road was the Cracciolo family. And they basically, when you look at the records, everybody lived next door to each other. It was like one of these big, long buildings. And they apparently had boatloads of property and money, unlike, my mom's Italian family that didn't really have anything. And my father's family, his parents and grandparents, lived on a road perpendicular to there. So everybody was right there, but to your point, I had no clue. I had no idea that they were there. We were supposed to be there last April. That didn't happen. And we had a whole reunion set up. I was going to meet 20 cousins, third and fourth cousins that we had discovered. And they're still going back, 150, 160 years. There were still villas and palazzos and things that belonged to the family. Well, not anymore, unfortunately, but
Yeah.
but they did back then. And we were going to go to those places, and it was really going to be, an exciting trip. So now, have you done DNA?
Yes, but before we get to that, Bob, one of the other things I really encourage people is serendipity. Okay, I mentioned Francesca and finding her, and she is a gem. I mean, she took the time. She would talk to the town clerks and talk to the town clerk and talk to the priest, and she actually got photocopies, if you will, of all the original documents. So that's important. The second part is, and again, another family story, but my grandfather allegedly, after he abandoned the family, was, a womanizer, and he died foaming at the mouth, because that's what the family wanted everybody to believe. Well, the facts are he died of a heart attack in 1930, in Chicago. So I was talking to my cousin Mike and writing him back and forth, and I said, Mike, your mom, Francesca, interesting enough, is still alive. She was born in 1923. I said, would you ask her if she happens to remember anything about August, my grandfather? He said, she's got dementia, she's not too good, and so forth. But he asked her. Funniest thing, she says, yes, I happen to remember being at his funeral. So she'd been 7 years old. Mm. She said, he was quite a man about town. So the nugget of being a womanizer was true. It just didn't last long. Anyway, so, that's some fun. I mean, it's just, it's important to ask the question.
Yeah.
You may get a no as an answer, that's fine, but at least ask the question. Mike asked his mom, and that's great. Now she's passed on, but I have that story. With regard to DNA, I tend to be an early adopter. I took a Y DNA test in 2004 at Family Tree DNA. Now that's pretty early on. That's 16, 17 years ago. Because at the time, naive me said, well, if I put a pebble on the pond, the ripples will go out, and I'll find all these relatives. Well, of course, as we all know now, that ripple doesn't quite work. But I've done YNA testing just again and again and again in terms of what Family Tree DNA offers. I've probably had at least a half a dozen or more tests. If nothing else, I'm leaving a legacy of my Y DNA in terms of the Y DNA tree.
I did Ancestry. Well, not that early, but let's see, it's probably at least 12 years ago or something like that. And then I also did not too long ago Living DNA, because silly me, I thought since they're based in Europe that there'd be a whole bunch of Europeans doing the test. And that's not true. It's starting to slowly catch on over there, from what I understand. And I did find one or two people. What I did like about Living DNA versus the Ancestry was that you did get the maternal and paternal lines, and that was pretty amazing for anybody who hasn't gotten their maternal and paternal lines, is to find out the migration paths. And what was really very interesting about my mom is that they're from Torito, Bari, and the maternal line is like 96% from the Caucasus.
Wow.
I mean, totally shocking. My father's line shows the migration path up through like the Levant, and then through into the Alps. And today, most of the people with that DNA are either in that small region in Switzerland, a very, very tiny area of Spain, and Sardinia.
Mm-hmm.
So, for anybody who hasn't looked at that information, it is really, really very revealing. And, again, back to you're not really who you think you are. That really tells you that you're not really who you think you are. So whether it was through the DNA or whether it was just through your research, what was like the most amazing thing that you came across, other than the rogue grandfather there?
Yeah, right. Yeah. In some ways, a lot of discoveries are amazing. The name change is one. Finding Gloria, my other aunt, is another. I tend to have them also kind of like working for clients, if you will, that are beyond personal. For example, you just mentioned living DNA. I'm working with a client who wants me just simply to find a picture of her biological father. The problem is, your old mom never confessed who the biological father was. Oh. But there's a British background, and so I had her test at living DNA, as you did, because it really is kind of England-centric. Mm-hmm. The other part is simply trying to make connections through DNA. Unfortunately, there have not been any surprises. I mean, I did Ancestry like you, 23andMe, family tree DNA, MyHeritage. And in fact, some ways I like MyHeritage because it tends to be more world-oriented than, say, Ancestry, which tends to be concentrating here in the United States with its database. So every day, there's always some surprise. I guess the latest one, my Aunt Pauline. My Aunt Pauline married some guy by the name of Gail O'Rourke, Gail, Gail O'Rourke, in about 1940. And I found her marriage license. But again, the family story was it didn't quite work out. Gail wanted to go off and raise minks someplace in Wisconsin or Michigan. And I've been kind of looking to try to find this guy. Well, the lesson is keep going back to records you thought you looked at. Keep going back to Ancestry or Family Search or wherever. Up pops a World War II registration card for a Gail O'Rourke. And his wife is Pauline Frances O'Rourke, my aunt. Gives his birth date and his birthplace. And so with that, I can go find more information about him. Well, dear old Gail, it appears, may have been a man about town too, because he added the O to marry my aunt. He dropped the O after that. And Gail Rourke became a pillar of the community. Ironically, as obituary pointed out, he was a mink rancher and actually had national recognition for the mink he raised. Now, it will be a surprise to some people because I used the documentation to post that dear old Gail Rourke had actually married in 1940 my aunt. And I don't know if these folks understand that maybe he had more of a life than they knew about.
We'll be right back.
Lafayette, we are here. The French history podcast for the American public by a Frenchman. Learn all about France's fascinating history, its great characters like Charlemagne, Joan of Arc, Louis XIV, or Napoleon, but also the great events that marked France, Europe, and sometimes the whole world. Lafayette, we are here. Available wherever you get your podcast or on LafayettePodcast.com. À bientôt.
Wow, that is an interesting story. And yeah, to your point, I always go back. I tell people, sometimes you need to walk away for a couple of weeks if you're stuck and then, come back again. But I had an interesting find in that my second great grandmother on my paternal grandmother's side, her last name is Mohr, M-O-H-R.
Oh, okay.
M-O-H-R, from Lucerne, Switzerland. And I was like, I'm never going to find this Switzerland thing, right? Why was this woman in Naples, or, what was going on there? And one day I was just, bouncing around the internet, and I came across a book that listed the officers in the Neapolitan army in the 1860s.
Hmm.
So all of a sudden it was actually searchable, believe it or not. So I do a search on Moore, and up pops Bernardo Moore, who was a captain in the Swiss Guard in 1860, I think it was, assigned to Naples. So that I always thought the Swiss Guard, they're the guys who guard the Pope, but apparently they were mercenaries throughout Europe, especially I learned from the Catholic cantons like Lucerne. As I go through there, I see Filippo Caracciolo. He was a lieutenant in the cavalry of the Neapolitan army. Now, Filippo married Elisa Moore. Bernardo was her father. I eventually found the records. As they were indexing on the Antonati, Moore comes up 3 different spellings, and I was having such a tough time finding it. So now I know about Bernardo Moore, and I find a website that says, if you're looking for records in Switzerland, ancestry records, write us in English, Italian, or German, and we'll try to give you an answer. So I send out Bernardo Moore. Maybe not even a day or two, I get an email back saying, yes, we know the name. And they gave me a link to hand-drawn charts, family trees, going back to the 1400s.
Wow.
Not only for the Moore family, but then every other prominent family in Lucerne, of which there were probably, 20 or 25. They didn't have nobility, but they had, like any place else, they had their elites. And I was able to get her family back to about, 1500, and then all these other families back just from, luck, persistence. I don't know what you want to call it.
Yeah.
But I'll give you an interesting stories about DNA.
Okay.
My children are adopted.
Okay.
My daughter, she wanted to meet her birth parents as soon as she was 18, so we did that. And her birth mom has done it and everything. But once I got the couple of family names, I was able to start tracing it back. And most of her family comes through England, Wales, some French. And as I was tracing back, her family's been in the United States since probably the early 1700s. And she's a direct descendant of Daniel Boone, a direct descendant of Captain Morgan.
Wow.
She's related to the Dispensers from England.
Oh my God.
And she's I forget what, it's probably, 23rd, 24th, whatever number it is, great granddaughter of one of the Bassano brothers, who the Bassano brothers were Italian musicians that went to England and played at the court of Henry VIII.
Oh, what a connection.
So could you imagine? So I said, well, you're Italian. Now my son, he, for the longest time, he didn't, we kept saying, do you want to meet your birth parents? And he wasn't really that interested. We did his DNA a long time ago. And maybe 4 months ago, I got an email from his sister, his full-blooded sister. She wasn't adopted. He was the firstborn. And so he's gotten to meet his family now and all of that. So, happy story there. But interesting thing about DNA, our son is a 5th or 6th cousin of my wife.
Oh yeah.
She's half Puerto Rican. He's half Puerto Rican.
Yeah.
And, it popped up. And she's also a distant cousin of one of my very good friends from college.
Oh my goodness.
From Sicily.
Gee, what a connection.
Yeah. And he called me one day and he said, do you know who MR is? I see it in your tree. I said, that's my wife. And he said, well, we're cousins. So,
fantastic.
So, strange things like that happen. And this same cousin, not cousin, but this same friend, he found his older half brother that he never knew existed.
Yeah.
It was never mentioned. And he said, of course, his father's no longer alive. His mother probably never knew.
Yeah.
And, he doesn't know. His brother doesn't know. The guess is that, it was probably, I guess, the late 40s. And he must have had something, back then they would take the baby and spirit it away or whatever they would
Yeah.
do, So he made a connection that he never knew about.
Yeah.
But now, so one half of your family is Italian. The other half was, what'd you say, was it Macintosh?
Yeah, Scottish.
Scottish.
Yeah.
So how long have they been in the country?
Not that long. My great-great-grandfather came in about 1850 from Scotland. But I got to tell you, I'm sorry, I got to tell you a why DNA story.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So I have a great uncle who was Vincenzo, became Jimmy when he came here. He signed the death certificate for my grandfather. So I did some research on him and I started digging around, found out he had 3 kids. Okay. And then I traced those kids because I wanted to find more Venziano cousins. Well, I imagine through probate records and what have you, found a Jimmy Venziano in Sunland down by Los Angeles. So I contacted him and, very, very me, I typed out a letter and mailed it off. And he writes me back in longhand and I type him another one and mail it off. And he writes me back in longhand. I went, wait a minute, don't be such a snob. Write him back handwriting wise. Okay. So I made a connection with Jim and we met at his house and he had this stack of photographs on the table, and I'm holding one up and saying, who's this and who's that? He says, that's okay. I got lots of them. You can have them all.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's nice. Yeah.
And so he told me his life story. I mean, it's like, wow. Okay. Time moves on. I trace some more and I find a cousin Paul who's living in Virginia. And so he and I get together and I go back to Virginia because my daughter's there. And I say, let's go to dinner. So, of course, you go to an Italian restaurant, right? You have a nice Italian. So Paul and I talk and talk and talk. And about halfway through it, he says to me, oh, by the way, I'm adopted. And so is my sister. And Jim was adopted too. So, you can follow DNA, but you got to follow it to the right person. Oh, God. Yeah, but anyway, yeah, so it's Macintosh and Rader and Pearson, and there's a lot of names on my mother's side on that particular side. And so, yeah, I've done the research on the Macintoshes and actually been to Elgin and Nairn in northern Scotland, where they originated from a couple of times. So, that's another whole area of research that one has to do.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, we're kind of blessed now. You can do a lot of this research, at home, sitting at a computer and things like that. My biggest regret is because I always liked history and I always liked the family. I used to like looking at the pictures of, in the book with the wooden cover and the black pages and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And my biggest regret is never asking, my grandparents questions. I never even asked my dad, and I don't know, I'm sure he knew a lot. When I asked my cousins that live with my grandmother on my father's side or on my mother's side, they certainly have some more stories because they would converse a little bit more. And when I asked my cousin about my father's mother, I said, actually none of them really talked that much about Italy, but they said, no, she never brought it up. She said, the only thing she would say is that there was an admiral in the family, Quacciolo family, and there was a saint, and that her cousin was the princess. Mm-hmm. And we just thought she was, but it was true. Her cousin was the princess because her great grandfather was the prince. So, those things. And, Prince of Tortoriolo, I don't know, how they gave these titles out in Italy, but, I started researching her family because she brought from Italy a card, or actually a box. My cousin, I think he still has it, from her father. And on the card, it has his name, it has the crest, and it says, from the Dukes of Capricotta. And my mother would always say he was a count or something, but he actually didn't have the rights to any of the title because the title went down through one of his uncles, down through cousins, but they still use the titles over there.
Yeah.
They still have it, and it's still, surprisingly enough, they still update them.
Yeah.
When you
Wow.
look at the records, it's still updated through that one side of the family.
Yeah.
And my biggest thing was I knew Piromal. There was only one Piromal. There were no other Piromalos. But when I looked at the records online, these nobility records, there was a family, Piromalo Capici Piccicelli. And I couldn't figure it out. I kept thinking, I said, this has to be the family because there's no other family. Slowly, when I started talking to them over there, what happened is that my third great grandmother, her brother had no children. Somehow, she was able to get the title of Duchess. Very rare in Italy. That's very, very unusual. When she got that title, she merged the family names.
Oh.
So she changed it for her son, her firstborn son only got the name Piromallo Capici Piccicelli. Everybody else, all the other children just had the Piromallo.
Interesting.
So there's two distinct families. I mean, we're all from the same place.
Yeah.
Some use the three names. The ones that inherited the title have the three names, and everybody else is just Piromallo.
Yeah.
So it's like, that was making me nuts. That was driving me crazy. So, yeah, go ahead.
One other highlight from the trip to Sicily with my cousin Paul. Paul's a good Catholic, and we were in Calascibetta. We took it again on our own. We went there because that's where the family was last. And we found the church, and Paul said, and we went on Saturday to kind of scope it out so we could go to Mass on Sunday. Paul says, well, I haven't been to confession in a while. I think I better go find the priest. And so in his broken Italian, basically remember what his father would say to him, don't do that, shut up, whatever it was. But it was enough, Paul's gregarious, and so he went to the priest, did his confession, what have you. We go to the church the next day, and the three of us are sitting in the pew, quite attentive. And all of a sudden, the priest, during the service, stops the service and points the three of us out and who we are and why we're there. I mean, that to me is a big thrill to have been back in the church of my grandfather and great-grandfather, and then have the priest recognize us. And afterwards, he says, come over here. And he showed us the old part of the church. It was really centuries ago, hidden away in the new church itself. So there's all kinds of possibilities. If you need to go to confession, go to confession. You never know what it'll lead.
Yeah. Well, I interviewed Paul Nauta he's from FamilySearch.org. He's the head of marketing, right? And he said that, my next door neighbor, he said, whenever he meets somebody Italian, he says, oh, my friend's Italian, they'll take you to lunch. So he said, the guy was there to do some research, and my friend gave him my name and my number, and he said, call Paul, he'll take you out to lunch and all of that. So the guy calls, and he says, I could tell he's embarrassed and everything. He said, but he was from Italy, so we went to lunch and everything. So then he says, I'm from Sicily. So he said, well, my family's from Sicily. They're from this town. And he said to him, you come to Sicily, and I will take you to that town, and I will take you to that church. I know the church. I know the priest. If you come, I will take you there. So he said, well, what am I going to do? I have to go, right?
Yeah.
So he says he gets there, and to your point, it's in, the oldest, darkest part of the church where all the records are. And he said, it's this little stone room with the door, the oak door and everything.
Yeah.
And he said, the priest told him, I really shouldn't leave you here. He says, I'm really not supposed to leave you here. He said, but if you let me lock you in,
Uh-huh.
you could stay. So he said, I don't know if it was 2 or 3 days. He said, we get there early in the morning. We go in, he'd lock the door.
Wow. Wow.
He said, we do our research.
Yeah.
He said, we have all of these books. He says, it was a little eerie. He said, but and then he said, initially he said, there's no food, no drink. He said, the second day he came in and he gave us brought in something to drink and something to eat. But it's stories like that. I mean, what are the odds? Another quick story from him too. He was doing a seminar in Pennsylvania. And he knew his grandmother was married in Hoboken. Couldn't find a record. And he said, I'm in the booth. I look over, there's a lady there. And it says, State Archives of New Jersey. So I said, I got to lose. I'll ask her. Yeah. So he mentions it. And he said, she kind of like blew me off. He said, but I wasn't surprised. He said, the next day, just before I'm going to do my talk, she comes up to me. She hands me a pink envelope and says, after you finish, open this. So he said, like, I've got like 2 minutes. And she said, just go do your thing and then open. He said, I opened it up and it was my grandmother's marriage license. And the most amazing part of the story was a few days before he went there, he says, I looked up and I said, please, Grandma, I forget her name. Give me something.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not fate.
Yeah.
There's something behind all of this. I keep saying that,
Yeah. Right.
So I just briefly, I want to talk a little bit. Now, you were the president of the California Genealogical Society, and I didn't realize before we stopped, but it does sound like you offer services to people too. So maybe you could talk a little bit about both of those.
Yeah, part of me is giving back. Okay, I mean, I've got a long resume if you want to spend another 30 minutes, but we'll skip over that. I do take clients, and it's always challenging because it's necessary to learn what they've learned, know what they've known, and build on that. As I said, my current client wants a picture of her biological father. But the joy of doing genealogy is making connections. And she's done DNA, just so you understand. And she came to me with some of these cousins she thought she had. As a result of that, it's pretty straightforward to know who her biological father was. I'm still trying to figure out more about him. But as a result of that, one of the joys is I started writing the cousins or the descendants of the cousins. And all of a sudden, the family, which hadn't talked to each other, started talking to each other back and forth. Some are in Australia, some are in New Zealand. And one person went after her husband's cousin. And all of a sudden, he starts to divulge family stories. And he's born in 1937. So he has quite a long memory of stories. So one of the fun things about working with people is the ancillary, if you will, part of it. Get into the talk. And of course, my client loves it that all these stories are coming about for her big extended family. And again, as you said earlier, Facebook's another great source because she can now tie together with cousins in Australia that are on Facebook and see them and see their kids and see their grandkids and exchange stories and so forth. So it's good. I'm actually part of the Association of Professional Genealogists, APG. And so you can find me there. You can find my bio there and find out some particulars about me in the areas I'm interested in researching.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I was lucky with one story in that, going back to keeping records and having these stories and everything. I learned, I guess about 2 years ago now, my oldest uncle from my mom's family did not come to America. He was 2 years old and left behind. And he was left with his grandparents. And I heard 2 stories. One was that they were planning to go back, like a lot of Italians did. They were going to maybe make some money and go back. The other story I heard was that they were going to send for him him, but they didn't have a lot of money. And my grandmother, they had 9 kids, and I guess it was just tough to get back.
Yeah.
So my uncle grew up in Italy.
Mm.
And by the time he wanted to come, he was 18, so he couldn't come on his own. And by that time, the immigration laws were changing and everything, I guess. He had to go in the Italian army. So all my cousins were born there. My youngest cousin from that uncle, just before my uncle passed away, he interviewed him in Barese. And when I learned of this, I said, Joey, you gotta translate this thing. And he said, I tried a couple of times. He said, I couldn't do it. I listened a little bit. I got broken up. I couldn't do it. I said, you have to, this is the family history. This is the story of where we come from.
Yeah.
So he said, well, first I have to get a tape recorder, a reel-to-reel tape recorder to listen to it.
Wow.
He says, I have to do that first. He said, but I promise you I will do it. So he sat down with his sister and they transcribed my uncle's story from, I guess, basically from maybe around 1910, 1911 through till when he came to Canada in the 1950s. So,
Wow.
things like that are just priceless. And that's, that to me is half the fun of this whole thing, is the discovery. And, a lot of people think I'm nuts, but I feel I have a mission to find this stuff out.
Yeah. 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 And the good news, those of us that are involved in it understand each other. We all share the same mission.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And the technology is changing too. Just a quickie. MyHeritage just came out with this feature on their mobile where you can use your mobile, take a picture of whatever it is you want, and you can talk about it. You can immediately record your story associated with that picture.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which I just think is phenomenal.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah. And for everybody, that's the thing. The technology keeps changing and improving, and, find one you like and stick with it. But there's just all kinds of resources.
Yeah. And, I've done Family Search has been really, really nice to me. They've given me a few interviews with a few different people.
Yeah.
And they offer, a lot of people may not know this, they offer a free 30-minute consultation.
Yep.
So if you have a roadblock or something like that, for anybody listening who's stuck and doesn't know where to look, you could sign up with, and it's free. Sign up with familysearch.org. And I did 2. One was Italian, the other one was Spanish, because I do have I have a lot of old Spanish, through this one line, but a fairly recent one that was a roadblock. And she found something and then gave me a whole bunch of links and books to look at to try and find the link to that person.
Yeah. I'd like to come back to Facebook again, because what you just said, there's a Sicilian group on Facebook. Unbelievable, helpful people. I'm trying to find, I don't know, the husband of a great aunt. And I know her, I know they had a child, and I'm not sure about him. I'm trying to find Camarati is a name. I'm trying to find out. So I found, a birth record. And so I put it up to the Sicilian group. Within 2 minutes, somebody had translated it for me. They're just gobs of people who will be helpful, whether it's the Sussex England group or the Sicilian group or whoever. Facebook takes a lot of grief, but let me tell you, the genealogy people on Facebook are fantastic.
Yeah, they all are great. And Camarati's was the Italian deli up the block from my grandmother's in Corona, Queens.
Oh, good story. Good story.
So I'm sure they were probably Sicilian, in that being the case.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thanks, Jeff. This has been really great fun. I really appreciate you taking the time, and we'll post everything out there. So if people want some input from you, they'll be able to find it.
Thank you, Bob. I really appreciate your asking. It's just a joy to talk about family.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.